You might not know that once upon a time, a League Classic server did actually exist. In fact, this footage is from that very server. Over the last few years, classic versions of games have become one of the most popular ways to breathe the fresh air of life into a franchise. Yeah! Video game companies capitalizing on nostalgia, underdog developers fighting against all odds to create incredible projects that turn into official projects down the line. This isn't one of those stories.
They forced Chrono Shift to shut down. What's Chrono Shift?
Chrono Shift was a project made by an independent group of people.
A representative of Riot Games attempted to extort them into handing over the code and the chronoshift.dev website.
This is the story of a small group of developers who went to war with Riot Games. This is the story of Chrono Shift.
There's a place where our secrets rise to the surface, they come alive. I see you through windows, my soul's just an echo, lost in time.
March 2017. Right in the middle of a market moving rapidly toward a resurgence of classic games, a small group of passionate developers started to work on a secret project. This project was led by a developer called Lethendran. Lethendran, along with his team, only had one goal: create a way for the community to experience the old League of Legends. When you look at the player counts of other classic games versus their retail counterparts, the retail version will almost always have a higher population. Despite this, classic versions of games always feel more popular. If you've noticed this and thought it didn't make any sense, then you wouldn't be alone, but it turns out there actually is a reason behind it. Let's take a look at World of Warcraft, which has one of the biggest classic communities out of any game. The retail player base absolutely dwarfs the classic player base, but the classic version of the game has almost always held the crown when it comes to things like viewership on Twitch, YouTube, and other social media. This in turn creates a tight-knit community, which can explain why the game feels more popular even though the raw statistics disagree. Despite a similarly high demand for a classic mode in League, Riot has never officially supported it. So Lethendran and his team made a choice that would change their future forever. They were going to build it themselves. This secret project was codenamed Chrono Shift. Their version of the game was going to include old items like Deathfire Grasp and old champions like Poppy and Sion before they got reworked. Specifically, it was going to run on the patch where Xerath was released. This was October 2011, right in the middle of Season 1's end and Season 2's start. As you can imagine, creating a server for a version of League that technically doesn't exist anymore was no simple task. What most people don't know is that at the time, all the building blocks you needed were already available. In fact, Riot were the ones handing them out. Riot used to have a publicly accessible CDN. A CDN, or a content delivery network, is like a worldwide network of storage hubs that keep copies of data, like game files, videos, and images, and this is so that they can be loaded faster from a location closer to you. It wasn't just the latest patch data that was stored on the CDN though, it was every patch that League had ever released. This actually did have a purpose behind it. Sites like the League of Legends wiki used to use this to make sure old data was correct, and modders and content creators could use it for making things like custom skins. When Riot themselves made polls for champion reworks, the old champion models were actually pulled from the CDN. This was good to cover the majority of the assets that the Chrono Shift team would need for development of their private server, but then of course there was still the server part. The Chrono Shift team had to rebuild the entire League of Legends server from scratch with no help at all. Aside from the obvious issue of connectivity, this also included all the logic for the game's spells, items, movement, and everything else that came along with it. But as time flowed on, the devs slowly but steadily made progress on their vision. It was right on the cusp of being a playable time capsule, a playable version of a game seemingly long since forgotten. At this point, the developers could have continued to work in the shadows and the video would probably end here. But their next move would land them on the radar of some very powerful people, getting their attention and jeopardizing the entire project. A few days later, as Lethendran left his house, he walked past a small package sitting on the sidewalk. He didn't notice it. This package had a slight glow. The next passerby noticed this unusual glow and picked it up, taking it home. Upon returning home, he opened it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The sheet of paper contained a URL, Confused, he went to his PC and navigated to the website. The website contained countless lines of personal information about him, personal address, browsing history, and exposed passwords. It had all been gathered into one location from years of data breaches and data brokers harvesting and selling this information on the black market. But it also had something else. A button to delete all of this information from the internet, to wipe the slate clean once and for all. Today's sponsor, Aura, helps you remove your personal information from the internet and get it out of the hands of hackers and data brokers. It also protects you from future breaches, keeps you safe from spam calls, and also offers a VPN so you can browse the internet safely. You can try out Aura completely free for 14 days by heading to aura.com/Ryskew. By trying it out for yourself, not only are you keeping your personal data safe, but you're also directly supporting the channel. On March 20, 2020, a Reddit user called ChronoShiftDev made a new post titled, "Announcing the ChronoShift project, a way to play old versions of League of Legends." ChronoShift is a work in progress server for old versions of League. Supported game clients can connect and talk to the server just like they did when the official servers for those versions were online. This enables players to experience the game as it was at the time. Currently it only works with a specific game client from 2010, but with some effort it can be modified to support other versions from around that time. And further efforts could push the compatibility to slightly newer versions. They had a lot of plans for the server. It was going to include all the champions through to Trundle, so 65 in total, all 14 summoner spells in the game at the time, 5 fully functional maps. This included Summoner's Rift, the autumn and winter versions of the map, Twisted Treeline, and the Proving Grounds. Despite the team working on ChronoShift for multiple years before this announcement, it wasn't completely finished yet. This is part of the reason that the developers felt forced to post it to the public before it was ready, putting themselves in front of dangerous Riot eyes and dangling the project's future over a chasm of uncertainty. Specifically, they needed some help finishing 3 main parts: Runes and Masteries, Performance, and Pathfinding. The basic pathing that would ignore walls worked fine, but it didn't take into account other units, and sometimes units would go through each other and minions would get stuck in the same spot. This was the most serious issue of the 3. Therefore, a large reason for the team making this post in the first place was to try and gather feedback and find possible testers. After all, they were a pretty small team. Because it wasn't finished yet, the code for the game was also all closed source. In their own words, "We hope to eventually open source the project, but first we want to centralize testing and avoid issues with bad actors who may attempt to use our work to enrich themselves or would bring the project into disrepute." There's a good chance you've probably heard these terms, open source and closed source, thrown around before, but let's talk about how they specifically affected ChronoShift. You're probably watching this video on a computer or a laptop, or maybe you're watching this on your phone sitting in the bathroom. Your computer is probably either running Windows or Mac, and maybe your phone is an iPhone that's running iOS. All of these operating systems are closed source, meaning that the companies keep the code under lock and key. An example of an open source operating system would be Linux. In fact, you can go on GitHub right now and see every single line of code and every single change that was ever made to it, when it was made, and who made it. The advantage to open sourcing fan-built projects like ChronoShift is that anyone can make a fork of the codebase and build upon it themselves. This would have eventually turned ChronoShift into something unstoppable. Even if Riot forced the ChronoShift project to take their code down, it would have just popped up again somewhere else eventually. But it wasn't open source, and as soon as that Reddit post went live, the clock began ticking. In the weeks that followed this post, countless videos of people playing classic League of Legends began to surface. The version of League that people fell in love with, as unbalanced as it was at the time. Some players managed to play more than 150 games in the time it was online, and they shared the insanity of it all, and what it was like to revisit an old version of the game that a lot of people have forgotten about or just never had the chance to experience. These were some of the conclusions that players came to after revisiting Season 2. This of course would only last until Riot made their next move, but let's talk about the good times while they were still possible. Roles were far more defined and served unique purposes. There were fewer jack-of-all-trades type champions. The carries, usually the ADC and the AP carry mid, were typically the only damage machines of the team. Bruisers and assassins were a special case. They still had carry potential in the mid-game when they were fed, but they would always fall off as the game progressed. Junglers and supports were lower income, but they were still fun to play because of their unique role in the game. To quote the recap, in ChronoShift you don't show up at level 6 or 7 as a Jarvan or Lee Sin and 100 to 0 some poor guy with Red Smite. Instead, your job is to secure map control for your team with ganks and vision. Damage levels were somewhat lower, especially early game, and teamfights were longer. Laning phases were more about efficient trading and less about all-ins as a result of the lower early damage. The laning phase felt more like a good game of chess and less like a Street Fighter match. ADC was weaker early game, but it was a scaling monster at 3+ items. The feeling of having agency on the outcome of the game was much higher because you knew every CS that you got was one step closer to your huge power spike. And finally, the champion balance did not hold up. With everyone being so much better at the game than they were in 2011, certain champions like Lee Sin was super OP. He was so far ahead of every other jungler that it just wasn't even a contest. There was also some items like Deathfire Grasp, which were insanely powerful, to the point where people just started making lobbies where the item was banned. If you weren't around back then, Deathfire Grasp was an item that originally built out of Kage's Lucky Pick and Fiendish Codex. If you were playing Veigar, for example, and you got to 1000 AP, you'd be doing a total of 55% of someone's max health with a point-and-click item on a 1-minute cooldown. This even led to the community and devs discussing light balance changes. They didn't know this at the time, but they wouldn't even have the chance to. When Chrono Shift was initially announced, a writer left a bit of a foreboding message for the developers. Hijacking to say please don't do this, we have a very simple and easy to read policy around developing products around Riot Games. Please read the legal jibber jabber, yes that's what it's called, and the policies on developer.riotgames.com. Riot Gene. The relevant parts of the policies that he was referring to were please don't take any part of our IP, e.g. character appearance, abilities, maps, icons, items, etc. and use it in a game or app. Despite this comment, the project carried on for almost exactly a year, from March 20, 2020 until April 20, 2021. That's the day that the lead of the Chrono Shift project received one of the most infamous messages in League of Legends history. Hi, Zed here from the Riot Games security team. I'm sure you can probably imagine why we might be reaching out to you, but in the interest of keeping things brief, we need to talk. I see you're on Discord now, shall we? The Riot Games legal team isn't super thrilled about your project unfortunately, and is looking for a way to come to a mutually acceptable end to it. The courts are always an option, but it's long and messy, so we thought we'd do some outreach to see if we can work together to prevent everyone the trouble. Lithendrin was in the middle of getting set up at work, but nevertheless was still happy to discuss the project. I admire the effort to cleanse your channels, but I'll be real with you, that's making me think like you don't have a ton of interest in cooperating. At the end of the day, that's fine, but I'd urge you to give us some credit. We archived all your messages long before you nuked the channel. You can delete the private channels too if you'd like, you know, mod chat, backend to do, game issues archived, old videos, etc. But I'd prefer you didn't since it really won't do you any good anyway. You've obviously put a lot of work into Chrono Shift, but I assure you that the Chrono Break is coming. It was hard for anyone to believe that an actual representative of Riot Games, speaking on behalf of the company in charge of the biggest game in the world at the time, would conduct themselves like this.
Me personally, as you guys know, I've worked with Riot a couple of times, I've modeled for them. What I said immediately when I saw all of this was there's no fucking way. There is no way that this is actually Riot. How is Riot going to send their most angsty, edgelord, teenage son with the least amount of professionalism to cease and desist an entire project?
I appreciate the effort, but you can dispense with the scare tactics. Understood, and I appreciate that you're taking the time to speak with me, but let's not try to work around each other. If it was scare tactics Riot wanted, you wouldn't be speaking to me. The writer then laid out the company's demands. One of the other developers who worked on the Chrono Shift team has had their name redacted from the original message. Hand over the chronoshift.dev website to us, hand over all source code, tell us all identifiable information you shared with, and what identifiable information he shared with you. Not necessarily required, but I'd be curious to know how you and broke down the workload. Give me a moment to confer with. Sure, but for what it's worth, it is my understanding that there isn't really anything to the legal strategy you referred to in the informational channel. With respect, sir, I'd appreciate if you could turn off the Scare Script Kiddie script with me. I am willing to cooperate, but I find this sort of attempted browbeating annoying. The conversation didn't seem to be proving fruitful for either party. Lithendrin and the Chrono Shift team had gone through extensive talks with lawyers. They were convinced that they hadn't broken any laws. They weren't distributing any Riot assets. If someone wanted to play Chrono Shift, they'd have to download files from the CDN that Riot themselves were hosting. I would appreciate to know exactly what you intend to accuse us of. As you've clearly been lurking our channels, you must know the great lengths we've gone through to avoid distributing your materials except via channels you already provide. That is correct. Till now, I've said give this or we will sue. That's the offer. Give me what I'm looking for and we won't sue. Refuse and we will. The ironic twist is that in order to see hidden channels on the ChronoShift Discord server, Zed used an add-on that broke Discord's terms of service. Here's my counteroffer. I cut ties with this project, and I tell to shut it down immediately. I can't compel him to do anything though, that's on you. I don't control the website, and I don't want to rat on other people. If you know who they are already, you can threaten him too. Otherwise, feel free to serve me. I wish I could say it's been a pleasure. This conversation was so unprofessional from the side of Riot that when the screenshots were first released to the public, most people thought it was a hoax.
But apparently, news came out today that this was real.
Lethendrin released a statement on behalf of the ChronoShift team explaining their side of the story. Today, Riot Games' security department has contacted us and tried to extort us into handing over our code and website to them. To our best knowledge, in the assessment of lawyers specialized in IT copyright we talked the project over with, we haven't done anything illegal. ChronoShift has not interacted with the live game or live game accounts in any way, shape, or form. This project has always been about the preservation of the early seasons of League that cannot be experienced anymore, a time capsule for something long gone that people still express a lot of interest in to this day. Shortly after ChronoShift had been shut down, Riot took down their CDN without any official statements. 9 years of history vanished into thin air. Its only remaining trace belongs to the few members of the community who created backups for personal reasons. Another team wanting to replicate ChronoShift's efforts would have a much more difficult road ahead of them. Right now, ChronoShift and any other possibilities of a classic League server remain a distant fantasy, but the team behind ChronoShift still lives on. Over the past few years, they've been developing their own MOBA from scratch, called Syndicate of Souls. Their aim is to capture the feeling that early League had, and early previews have been met with overwhelmingly positive feedback. Two different sides to the same coin. On one side, a project destroyed, never able to live long enough to see its full potential. On the other side, a new project, born from the ashes of ChronoShift. An idea that may never have been realized if not for the persistence of Lethendrin and the rest of the developers.